Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be my last draft so far for Club World Cup. I will be live streaming probably around the deadline. I know the deadline's around 1 a.m. I believe UK time, so I will be around there. I will be streaming, and the plan is to, basically check that all the players that I've deliberately targeted to be below 5% are going to be below 5% by the deadline. And I think it's so crucial for that to happen. Why do I think that that's the case? I really think that in a game like this where it's so easy to touch this threshold of 4 points because the game rewards you with more points than ever. So I think what's needed, from a threshold perspective to get towards 4 points is the lowest it's ever been for a fantasy game that I've seen. You get additional points for getting clean sheets. You get additional points for getting goals from whatever position on the pitch you play, compared to any other fantasy game. And as I said, if you get 4 or more points, you get those access to the 2 bonus points. And I really think that's completely radically changed my draft. Another thing that's changed in terms of my draft structure is I have moved towards a wildcard 3 structure. Not because I think that this element of rotation is going to completely, kneecap, I suppose, my matchday 2 wildcard structure, but more so the case of actually looking at my matchday 3 theoretical draft and then actually running that against my matchday 2 wildcard draft and actually realizing that the only difference with the players that I'm actually going for is actually the Brazilian or South American players, which includes also some of the players from River Plate as well, who have a really good game in matchday 1. So that was kind of my concern. I think players from Botafogo and Flamengo, there's probably going to be less access to these sorts of players. But, my general, viewpoint, I suppose, is if the drafts aren't too different, then I guess I might as well bake in the idea of rotation and then I can live with that with a matchday 3 wild card. And I think the team that I've actually ended up with, comparing to a lot of people's drafts and obviously just looking at the base ownership is very differential to a lot of people. And I think for good reason. I've looked at very much the market odds and how they've progressed. I think we've also gotten more updated transfer news regarding certain players and whether they're going to feature for their teams or not. And that makes things quite interesting. But from a perspective of this draft, I think the idea is that a lot of the highly owned players within my team here, I think, are either too cheap to ignore or actually are very expensive, but I'm happy to sort of use 2 free transfers on them between matchday 1 and matchday 2 so that I can actually target teams like Benfica a little bit harder. Or if I'm already maxed out on Benfica, then I target other good fixtures on display. So what's a good example of this? I think, the likes of Chelsea, for example, have a tougher fixture in matchday 2. I think equally you could probably say that for a team like, let's say, Flamengo as well, right? So these kinds of teams have good fixtures in matchday 1, but you would happily use a transfer from these players in matchday 2 because if the ownership of these players is very high anyways in matchday 2, you might as well be served to move towards the differential anyways. There are also some players that I think are outright hard to sort of bypass, and I think Kane, Olise, Dumfries, these are the 3 players in my opinion that make it almost impossible to draft without because they're just that strong, and I think their competing picks just aren't at the same level. Why do I say this about someone like Dumfries? I think with Ryan Nuri joining the Man City team, that kind of nerfs the appeal of Guardiola, so there's no comparable option. Trent's probably the next best attacking fullback option, or maybe Cambiaso. Both of these players are actually above 5% ownership, so then at that point I would probably just look at thinking, is Dumfries better than Trent outright? Is Dumfries better than, let's say, any other attacking fullback that's over 5% ownership outright? And I think the answer is yes. So therefore, the next best comparison for someone like Dumfries is, can I get away with someone who's sub 5% ownership? And personally, I don't think I can. So those are the kind of players that I think have stayed within the draft. And to sort of get an updated perspective of the match day odds, we have the same data sort of provided by Schadenfreude. So if you watch my first draft video, this is an update towards the data there. Clean sheet odds, of course, on display as well. You can kind of see that the goals haven't really moved too much. I think actually the goals have moved more in favor of Bayern towards Auckland, which is so impressive, I guess, in terms of how weak I suppose we have, let's say, Auckland City modeled as a team to target, which is great, which is also why you can probably see that I've got much more Benfica players in my draft now. Now, Benfica played Boca Juniors in the first round, so I think it's very sensible to actually own Benfica players for the perspective of knowing that you're going to target them for matchday 2. And then from a perspective of matchday 1, you're comfortable with the fixture being not so bad. And I think this is very comparable to a team like, let's say, Dortmund, for example, who have less of a high-quality fixture in matchday 2, but then equally have a pretty nice game in matchday 1, similar to a Benfica. Maybe slightly better, but I think the gulf in matchday 2 is what makes me edge towards these Benfica players. So that's kind of my general sentiment right now. I think in terms of clean sheet odds, when we look at goalkeepers as well, and even defenses, I think teams that are still a little bit underrated from this aspect would still be Flamengo from a matchday 1 perspective. I think Chelsea is still very much high up there for that too. and clearly Benfica is up there too. The reason why I say this is because all the other goalkeepers with the extremely high clean sheet odds, unfortunately, are above 5% ownership. And as I said, I would like to target the differential point system here with my goalkeepers. So, without further ado, let's just jump into my draft and jump into defense. Sanchez and Trubin rather is the goalkeeper pairing that I've gone for. Now, these two players play on the same day, but actually you can sub players as soon as your player is in game. So for example, before, let's say, Trubin plays, I can just simply play Sanchez first, see what happens, keep Trubin on the bench, and then, reevaluate later. I've kept Dumfries in the team when it comes to defense, as I said. I think that sort of case in point that I made at the beginning in terms of him being the best attacking fullback on offer for Matchday 1 and Matchday 2 combined is still the case. I think him being so attacking seals that. Now, technically, Rafael Guerreiro is a fullback that I think is actually better than Dumfries for this purpose, but it's a bit of a cheat because we know that Bayern have almost, the best game on offer. I think the reason why I've actually gone from Rafael Guerreiro and actually moved away from someone like Serge Gnabry, even though Sané has actually been confirmed to play for or to move towards Galatasaray and is unlikely to play for Bayern in the Club World Cup, the reason why I moved into Rafael Guerreiro is actually because I do think that there could be a huge element of rotation with this Bayern team. So even though Gnabry could get conceivably good minutes, I think that someone like Musiala is looking to get minutes coming back from his injury. Someone like Muller is still in the squad, so he could play. And if Sané, of course, is within the team, or if Bayern actually seek out one of the left-wing options that they're actually targeting in the market, then that's a bigger problem point. And Koeman is still ultimately with this team as well. So I can see a lot of Bayern rotation. There's even been sort of news reporting from Bayern fan outlets, especially that sort of Mia San Mia account on Twitter, mentioning that Bayern have considered actually playing a B team versus Auckland City FC. Now, this is obviously disrespectful, and I think we have within a lot of the YouTube content around, and also just looking at Matchday, it's just simply discredited Auckland City. But I think there is a reason for that, and I think it's justifiable to think that Bayern will probably move around quite a bit. But I think what I like about Rafa Guerreiro, I suppose, is they don't have that much depth in the left back position. I quite like his ability to sort of meet that threshold of getting the clean sheet points. And as long as he plays on the pitch, he'll have access really to those kind of attacking returns. Compared to, let's say, someone like Gnabry, who, for all intents and purposes, could even be subbed off quite early in the match and actually not, achieve the expectations that we want from an attacking perspective. So that's kind of why I've moved towards Rafael Guerreiro from a draft structure. It's a little bit sad that I've gone for Rafael Guerreiro because I think he's unfortunately above 5% ownership. Right now, I believe he's around 8.3%, but he still is someone who I think is an extremely high quality pick for the perspective of this game, and I think he's also likely to play a match day 2 as well. The pick that I've actually added into my draft is actually Gatti, Kelly, and Carreras. Now, Carreras is a Real Madrid sort of left back transfer target, but he's already been submitted into the Benfica Club World Cup squad, and the expectation is that Carreras will play for Benfica for Club World Cup, and then he might be able to sort of finalize his move with Real Madrid. If you actually look at the minutes of all players for Benfica this season, Carreras is actually someone who actually has the second most amount of minutes outside of Trubin. So it just shows you how critical he is to this team. And I think from a defensive perspective, he's probably the pick that I like the second most actually from Benfica. I actually like Otamendi the most. But the reason why I've not gone for Otamendi is because I'm poor, because I've decided to spend money elsewhere. And I think they're both, similar options where at this moment in time, Carreras' ownership is sub 5%. And so I think he's actually still a very sensible pick as long as he stays below sub 5%. I also mentioned at the top why I'm sort of targeting Benfica, but I think equally you can still target a team like Dortmund as well. I just think that Carreras is probably the player that I would go with right now because of how good Matchday 2 is. As you can also see from a strategy perspective, I've actually decided to deactivate all my chips. My plan with the maximum captain chip is actually to use it later in the tournament. Even though the games are much more explosive in the group stages, I think that hopefully the idea is by covering, I suppose, 2 captaincies at least per match day, I would have most likely gotten as close to the best captaincy haul as possible. Whereas there's a lot more scope for error when you only have one go at the captaincy, potentially even in the final of the tournament. So I am probably deciding to right now deactivate all chips. I also previously considered going for the 12th man owner, but one of the reasons that has led me towards moving away from the Mbappe 12th man chip is his ownership is still very high, and I like to play with my differentials. I've decided to sort of ignore Mbappe for now, obviously at my own peril. And I didn't really want to go quadruple Bayern because of these sort of concerns over the minutes of certain players, even though it's probably the most one-sided game of the tournament. I just think I can't justify enough minutes right now from certain Bayern players, outside of maybe, let's say, a defender like, who knows, Jonathan Tah, or a goalkeeper like Manuel Neuer. But I just don't really see the need to sort of spend that sort of chip on that. And I'd actually much rather use the 12-man chip a little bit differently. And I'll talk about that when I go through the forward section in a little bit later. But that's kind of the idea within the defense. The reason why I've actually put Gatti into the team is because I think ultimately he should be someone who's actually playing for Juventus in the Club World Cup. I think the reason why I'm looking into it with a little bit more detail, why he missed out a lot of the games close towards the end of the season, why someone like Costa, for example, played for Juventus, is ultimately because he suffered an injury around, you know, the end of March, and was obviously clearly still recovering from that and wasn't really fit to play for the rest of the season. Whereas I think Kelly, of course, was playing and already sort of locked into the team. Bremer actually has been submitted towards the Juventus squad, but I can't see him getting serious minutes. I think he's going to build back his fitness, and that's going to take time. But my expectation is that Gatti and Kelly should be playing and should be starting for Juventus, and I'll take that risk, right? Ultimately, it's just one more defender. I think Juventus defenders, if I can get them right, will actually give me a lot of value. So that's really why I wanted to go for Gatti at this moment in time. And that's basically the defense as things stand. As I said, there's a lot of sub 5% defenders that make a lot of sense, and they're not featured within this draft necessarily. For the goalkeepers, it's a little bit trickier, because I think the only interesting goalkeepers that are sub 5% right now for me are Sanchez, Trubin, and also Rossi from Flamengo. But I think Sanchez is overall a slightly better pick than Rossi right now, and I didn't necessarily need to squeeze the money as my squad is currently constructed towards, let's say, dropping Sanchez. So that's why I've decided to go for this sort of structure. In the midfield, shifting over gears towards that, not much of my midfield has actually changed from my previous draft. I think De Arrascaeta and Palmer are amazing picks, really. And unfortunately, yes, of course, their ownership is a bit above 5%, but I think they are the talismans of the teams. They are potential penalty takers for the teams. Palmer, of course, confirmed, but that sort of value, I think, is very hard to miss, particularly from a Matchday 1 perspective. I also believe that these are the players that are most likely going to be the source of a transfer for Matchday 2. Maybe not Palmer necessarily, but I can easily see myself potentially transferring 2 players from my team in Matchday 2, and Arrascaeta is someone that can definitely go in Matchday 2, where he has a much weaker matchup, and I can benefit a lot more from moving to someone who actually has sub 5% ownership at that point in time. But the main addition towards this midfield is actually Aktürkoğlu from Benfica, and he's someone that I was deliberating between someone like Koku as well, so the other Turkish midfielder in the team. Aktürkoğlu, of course, is more of an attacker, Koku more of a midfielder, but Koku is actually overperformed massively, and I think he's also an extremely underrated pick in the game right now, that I still think possesses a lot of value. I still went for Aktürkoğlu because I think he actually probably just still has higher upside in terms of just being a more consistent goal threat, and I suppose my lack of belief that Koku's overperformance in finishing is that sustainable. I suppose I think there's more to be desired in terms of, you know, baking into someone like Aktürkoğlu anyways. So I've gone for my Turkish mid there, and Olise stays in the team because I think he's just that good of a pick. It's kind of hard to bypass someone like Olise, who I think is a bit more of a lock for the team, a bit more of a guarantee, and just simply has way too good of a game in Matchday 1. And when it comes to Matchday 2, you know, one of the interesting things I suppose is I do have an extremely sort of high effective ownership midfield, and that could change, right? Like maybe I shouldn't be carrying too many players because I only have 2 free transfers in Matchday 2, and maybe there's an opportunity, of course, on my end to maybe move away from Olise, move into a PSG player in the midfield, like someone like Barcola, for example, actually has sub 5% ownership, so he could be someone that is worth the transfer in Matchday 2. But I think it will just be useful for me to actually just get towards Matchday 2 and then make a decision, because I still think that, you know, owning Palmer, owning Olise for Matchday 2, even though their ownership is extremely high, is something that's, you know, totally fine. These are some of the best players in the tournament that we can actually pick from, and they just have a lot of inherent value. With Mastantuono, I think it was very hard also to sort of remove him from any of my drafts, because I think he's just way too efficient from a price point perspective. He's going to play for River Plate for this tournament. That is now effectively confirmed based on various sources of reporting that I've actually read over sort of his impending transfer for Real Madrid. And yeah, I just don't think any other midfielder is as mispriced as he is, nor as talismanic. And so therefore, I just think he's an amazing pick. So the midfield's a little bit template, but I quite still like the sort of differential that I have in Aktürkoğlu. And I think with the defense that I have, there's not too much room to need to use a transfer equally with the goalkeepers. And so shifting 2 of these sort of high ownership midfielders in Matchday 2 makes a lot of sense to me when Flamengo have a worse match. when Chelsea have a worse match and when even Bayern have a worse match. So that's kind of my immediate thoughts. In the sort of forward line, I've actually decided to go with Kane, Haaland, and Samu Agehoa. Samu Agehoa is Samu Omeridion. I just think he's once again another player in this game who is way too underpriced. And actually, it actually made more sense to me when I was looking at a wildcard 3 structure to actually have Samu in the team, because Porto's game in Matchday 2 is much better than their game in Matchday 1. But I talked about why I'm going chipless in Matchday 1. And the reason why I'm going chipless in Matchday 1 is because I plan to use the 12th man chip in Matchday 2 for Pavlidis to target Auckland in that sort of manner. I tend to think that maybe the Benfica minutes are a little bit more certain, a little bit more secure, a little bit more easy to sort of understand and get a hold of. They have less depthly than, let's say, a team like Bayern. And I think that's a good opportunity for me to target a relatively low-owned player in Pavlidis. And I think having the optionality of maybe not even going towards Pavlidis makes sense, because Pavlidis is someone who currently is most likely to move towards above 5% ownership in Matchday 2 as soon as people exercise their 2 free transfers. But at the same time, given that his ownership is so low, and a lot of people are actually going for a structure where they own Kane and Haaland or Kane and Mbappe, I do actually think that Pavlidis could actually still survive and be below that threshold of 5% by the Matchday 2 deadline. So I kind of like keeping that option, to my chest. And 12th man Pavlidis is sort of the idea. And I think, by going for this sort of structure, I almost have the best Benfica team possible, maybe a little bit weaker in terms of the midfield, but still strong. One thing I'll mention with Benfica too is I think Di Maria is actually going to play for them for this tournament. I've seen him in some of the friendlies. I think he's going to move to his club, Rosario, a little bit later in the year instead. And so he'll probably play these matches in June with Benfica here. And he's a little bit more expensive than Aktürkoğlu. And actually, if you look at my budget, I actually have nothing to squeeze. I've got 0.0 in the bank. The plan is to use the 2 free transfers definitely Matchday 2, because we'll be wildcarding out of that anyway. So that's kind of the plan at this moment in time, to go for Kane, Samu, and Haaland. That hasn't changed. And part of this is because I think from a decision-making standpoint, Haaland is still, on paper for me, the best captain in Matchday 2. So it was very hard, I guess, removing Haaland from the team. At the same time, some of the cheaper forwards are also above 5% in ownership. So there's no real need, I suppose, or justification to actually go for much cheaper forwards outside of someone like Pavlidis, who is the only kind of key forward that I really like, who's below 5%. And then when I shift gears back into the midfield, I think I could put the same argument there. There are some other midfielders that do interest me at the sort of 6 million, at the 7 million price point, or even Barcola at the 8.2 million price point. But I'm not going to go for these players in Matchday 1. I'd much rather use transfers to move towards them in Matchday 2, and then sort of, trust in that sort of differential structure that I've created. But that's going to be the team selection, I think, as things stand. I can't see ownerships changing too much. I have had to drop some players, unfortunately, from my team. For example, Di Gregorio from Juventus did hit 5%, so he's gone. Cambiaso has, hit over 5%. I believe he's 5.1% now, so he's gone too. But that is the lay of the land. I really do think targeting that plus 2 point structure is still very, very sensible. And I mean, the math is quite simple on that. I think if we were to look at, let's say, a poison distribution of any of these defenders that I've picked, that their average sort of expected point structure, or not point structure, but just average expected points on Matchday 1 and Matchday 2 are still very, very, very high. And so the probability that they're actually going to break that threshold of being a little bit higher than 4 points earned as opposed to below 4 points earned, so 0, 1, 2, or 3, is actually very tilted towards the positive side. So that's why I think going towards these sub 5% ownership players makes a lot of sense. I completely understand a lot of people aren't going for all these sub 5% ownership players, but I think part of this is too because this is the first time around we're seeing this, and I think some people haven't probably looked into the math of how strong these things are. We tend to trust in things like odds, we tend to trust in things like models, and their sort of projections, not to get things right perfectly the first time round, but actually just as an average expectation, right? Just something to level set with, something that's objective that we can refer to sort of make decisions and make better decisions. And in this case, I think it's equally the same. If you have expected points for certain players, and you know that there's a rule in place that actually rewards you for owning sub 5% ownership, and you get 2 points for it, I'll take every chance that I can get to probably maximize that in a game where I think it's very feasible to outscore a lot of the higher owned players with these lower owned players. And so that's going to be my last draft. I hope you guys have a wonderful time. See you guys soon for more content, and definitely, of course, on the live stream as well as we close in, and hopefully no more of my differentials hit above 5%.